Okay. I call to order the Wilsonville City Council work session on Monday, June 5th, 2023 at 5:02 p.m. And first, is there any review of agenda or agenda items or consent items? Looking around, not seeing anything. Okay. Or do we have any councilor concerns tonight? No. Then we will go ahead and jump in. Our first item, I believe, is the Frog Pond East and South Development Code. And we have a staff presentation here from Mr. Dan Pauly.
Good evening. And Dan Pauly, Planning Manager. Give me a moment to start the show here. What we didn't quite get through started in April, but didn't quite get through, and council expressed a desire to have some more conversation about, and that really is around multifamily housing and changing standards related to the design standards and review process for multifamily housing. The other item we didn't get to in April that I'd like to discuss with the council tonight as well is some changes to the allowance of accessory dwelling units. So both of these items have been identified through the master planning process of something that can be done to provide more housing options in Wilsonville. So let's start with the multifamily. So what we did get through really last time was multifamily design standards. So there's two portions of multifamily that we'll discuss, the actual design standards and where they come from. It's kind of a review, but really the focus of the multifamily discussion is the review process for this evening. So as discussed last time, multifamily design standards are really looking for something that's clear and objective, which we currently don't have. Currently, multifamily, for the most part, is reviewed similar to a commercial or industrial building where there's a lot of just kind of, it's supposed to look nice, essentially. Where all other housing types, including detached homes and middle housing, all have specific design standards. So what it has been recommended by the Planning Commission and the project team that we discussed last time, and I understood from this council that this was a good direction to be heading, is to adapt some standards from townhouses and other components from our middle housing standards adopted last, is it 2 years ago now? To apply those to multifamily because they're of similar size and bulk of buildings oftentimes, so it makes a lot of sense. While at the same time, however, parking and the way parking and site work for multifamily is different than townhouses generally, so adding some new specific standards in regards to that. And this is one of the standards that some of the same issues that really we need to address for the Frog Pond East and South Master Plan apply citywide. So the recommendation is to apply these same standards citywide. So some highlights of what's in these standards that we're talking about is orientation of the main entry, which really focuses on the pedestrian environment and keeps that focus. Minimum window coverage, which is a fairly common architectural standard. Facade articulation, that's something that's come up repeatedly as an important component of having a variety of design. And as we really surveyed what really makes a residential structure attractive and interesting, but doesn't add a lot of cost necessarily, is facade articulation. There's also standards around pedestrian connectivity and making sure parking is to the rear or side or otherwise screened. So then the big change, another big change that's being recommended is then how it's reviewed. So currently, multifamily, the architecture of a multifamily building has to go through the Development Review Board. And as we discussed last time, this becomes kind of interesting because under statute and state rules, the ability to review residential needed housing is pretty limited. And so if someone proposes it, essentially there's not much neighbors can say that if it's allowed under zoning. So that at times can be confusing to neighbors, saying you're having this public hearing, but really there's not much to say. So that process there's kind of a disconnect there that makes it difficult both for the neighbors as well as the DRB, who understand on one hand, their role that, okay, I have to be fair, I have to, this is an allowed use, I have to approve it, but then have a room full of angry neighbors that they're trying to, address their concerns. It really can be an awkward situation for them. And in some ways, I would say it's kind of a remnant of an era when there weren't stringent state rules about approving residential uses. So something else we heard from the City Council and Planning Commission during the Frog Point East and South Master Planning process is differentiating between these smaller apartment buildings, which we don't have a lot of now. There's a few examples in town, but are smaller and similar to size that maybe you'd even see in like a fourplex or middle housing, essentially, that really from a built form isn't that much different than middle housing, versus larger buildings over 6 units, which, the garden apartment style, which are larger, bulkier buildings, then maybe that might have a different review process, is really what came out of our discussion with Planning Commission. So what's been drafted is that for these smaller buildings up to 6 units, consistent with how detached homes, single-family detached homes, as well as middle housing is approved, it would just be approved through administratively with the building permit. There'd be no notice to neighbors. But then if you have a larger building, which can have architecturally have a kind of a more noticeable, I guess you would, kind of more as it's bulkier, where there is actually notice to neighbors and the public, and really to a balanced approach where they're informed but also understand the limits of the review. There's really specifically not whether there's an apartment there, but making sure that all those standards that have been agreed upon by within the city are being met. So I think this slide is helpful to really understand what is changing, because we're not saying that someone can come in and build a 500 apartment complex with 6 or 7 buildings just by talking to planning staff. That's not what we're saying. We're really talking about the architectural design of buildings. So currently, DRB reviews everything. This includes the functional layout of the site, where the drive aisles, where the parking is, how you get access to it. It reviews any plat or land divisions, any parks or open space, and notably the design of the buildings, as well as even the design of the shrubs around the base of the buildings and those details. Where for what's proposed, which is again consistent with middle housing as well as detached single-family homes, is the functional layout, where if there's streets or drives, where those are located, how the traffic circulation works, if there's any any subdivision that's being divided, as well as continue to design of the required open space, because all residential development requires that 25% open space, half of which is required to be active open space, like professionally designed park space, essentially. So then staff would, so essentially you'd have a plat or kind of a plan of that may indicate where buildings are going. But then when they come in for the actual construction of the building, the architecture, the final architecture and design of the landscaping immediately around the building would go through review by staff, the same as other residential types. So I'll pause there, happy to answer any questions, take any comments, and hope that I've made this a little bit clearer.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So I'm not, it wasn't clear to me in the document, and I'm sorry that I didn't ask you this in advance. When it discusses parking, is it all street parking? There's no, on these multifamily units, there's no allowed parking either behind the unit?
No, it's saying that parking has to be behind the unit. So it's not between the building and the street, or it's otherwise screened. So, yeah, similar to.
But it also talks about minimum lot, it's the distance to lot line.
Of the building?
Yeah, I think, let me see if I can find it again.
So really, as it regards to parking, I mean, parking's allowed, obviously, but and we have similar standards, even some of our industrial zones and including in our middle housing standards, where trying to encourage the parking, those functional parts that don't really add or contribute to the pedestrian environment to be either screened or to the side or behind, so really the buildings can have a presence on the street. Similar, like you'd see to the apartments in the village center or elsewhere, where it's not auto-oriented as some of the older garden apartments are, but really there is some pedestrian-oriented design.
So where in the document does it talk about, it talks about off-street parking, which is